The job that changed my life. They told me I was left at the hospital steps when I was just a few hours old. No note, no name, just a knitted blanket and a silver pin shaped like a star. I was raised in foster care, shuffled from one home to the next, never staying long enough to leave a dent on the walls or the hearts of the people inside them. By the time I turned 18, I stopped hoping anyone would come looking for me. I wasn't someone's daughter. I was just Lena, 23, alone, unremarkable. Until the day everything changed, with a phone call. It was a woman's voice on the other end, smooth and professional. "Is this Miss Lena Moore? We received your resume through the childcare network. A high-profile client is looking for a live-in nanny immediately. Good pay, safe environment, and long-term opportunity." I was used to temporary. I wasn't used to words like long-term. But rent was overdue, and I had 3 boxes of instant noodles left to my name. So I said yes. When I arrived at the Walsh residence in Westchester, I nearly turned back. The gates alone were taller than any home I'd lived in. The driveway wound like a private road, lined with trees that whispered secrets in the wind. The mansion beyond was stone and glass, towering and too quiet. I was led inside by a housekeeper who barely made eye contact. Everything smelled like lemon and money. "Wait here, Mr. Walsh will see you shortly." Mr. Ethan Walsh, a name I'd only heard on real estate signs and business headlines. Billionaire, widower, untouchable. When he finally stepped into the room, I forgot how to breathe. He wasn't just handsome. He was sculpted. Broad shoulders, gray at his temples, eyes the color of ash right before it turns cold. But what struck me most wasn't his appearance. It was the way he looked at me. Like he knew me, not as an employee, not as a stranger, but something else, something deeper. "You're younger than I expected," he said. I nodded nervously. "I've worked with children since I was sick," and he didn't smile, didn't soften. "It's my daughter Isla, 4 years old. She's bright, but closed off. You'll live on site. Weekends are flexible. We pay well." I agreed before I processed it all. Not because of the money, but because something about that house, about him, pulled me in. Isla was a whirlwind of curls and contradiction. She clung to books but hated being read to. She counted raindrops on the window but never remembered her own birthday. On my 3rd night there, I found her curled up in a blanket fort in the library. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I did. No one ever comes back." That broke me more than I expected. I held her hand until she fell asleep. And in that moment, I realized I wanted to come back. Every day, Mr. Walsh, Ethan, remained distant. He left early, came back late, spoke only when necessary, but I kept catching him staring when I was with Isla. There was no lust in his gaze, no inappropriate tension. Just wait. Like every time he looked at me, he was carrying something he couldn't put down. One rainy afternoon, I was reorganizing the linen closet and found a box tucked behind the towels. Old, worn, out of place in a house that was otherwise curated like a museum. Inside were photos, stacks of them. Family trips, a baby in a stroller, a young Ethan smiling, happier than I'd ever seen him. And then a girl, early 20s, long dark hair, brown eyes, my face. Not someone who resembled me, not a little bit alike. It was like looking in a mirror that reflected the past. In the photo, she stood beside Ethan. His arm was wrapped around her waist. Her hand rested gently on her stomach, as if she were expecting. I dropped the box. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was scared, but because something inside me had shifted. Questions I never dared to ask began clawing at me. Who was she? Why did she look exactly like me? And why did Mr. Walsh look at me like he was seeing a ghost? I walked to the mirror in my room, touched my face, held the silver star pin I still carried in my bag, and whispered, "Who am I really?" She called me sister without knowing why. Isla was never the kind of child who clung. She didn't cry when people left, didn't beg for bedtime stories, didn't run into anyone's arms, not even her father's. But with me, something was different. She followed me like a shadow, waited for me to brush her hair, even when the housekeeper offered. And when she had nightmares, it was my name she whispered through the dark. Lena. Not Miss, not Nanny, just Lena. Like she'd known me longer than the few weeks we'd shared. One afternoon, while we were painting with watercolors on the patio, Isla looked up and tilted her head. "You feel like a sister." I blinked, pausing mid-brushstroke. "A sister?" She nodded seriously. "You have the same heart." I smiled, but my chest tightened. "Same heart as who?" "As me." She tapped her chest with her little fingers. Same. I laughed it off, told her she was sweet. But that night, those 2 words haunted me. Same. Ethan had been even quieter lately. He barely looked at me during dinner. When I passed him in the hallway, his eyes darted away, like they were guilty of something. And when Isla called me sister again, in front of him, his fork froze midair. He didn't say anything, but his hand trembled. I couldn't let it go anymore. There were too many coincidences, too many silences that lasted too long. Too many moments where Ethan looked at me, not with attraction, but with recognition. So I went back to the photo box. This time I wasn't just looking. I was searching. I flipped through every picture, every envelope, every folded corner, until I found it. A picture of the same woman who looked like me, this time holding a newborn baby. The baby's face was blurry, but on the back was written, Lena, 2 days old. My hands shook. I dropped the photo. Lena? Was it me? It had to be. But how? Who was she? This woman who looked just like me and shared my name. And why did Ethan keep these photos hidden in a box no one was meant to find? I did what I never thought I'd do again. I went back to the foster home I'd aged out of. Miss Granger, the caretaker, still remembered me. You always liked silence, she said, smiling. Even when the other kids cried for attention, you'd just sit by the window. I swallowed hard. Do you still have my file? She hesitated, then led me to the archives. Most of my information was standard, no known mother, no known father. But one page had been torn, ripped straight down the middle, almost deliberately. All that remained was a smudged ink note in the corner. Placed anonymously, no contact, no ID. I stared at that note for a long time. Placed anonymously. But someone had written Lena on that photo. Someone had named me, before the system gave me their generic number. And if Ethan wasn't just my employer, if he had something to do with this, then who was I really? When I got back to the mansion, the air felt heavier. Isla ran to greet me, arms wide. Sister's back. I knelt to hug her, heart racing. Why do you keep calling me that, Isla? She shrugged innocently. Because that's what I feel. Like you were mine before. Before what? Before this house? Before she was born? I tucked her into bed that night, kissed her forehead, and sat in the hallway for a long time after. I wasn't sure what scared me more. The possibility that Ethan was hiding something from me? Or the possibility that he wasn't? The next morning, I asked him directly. It was early. He was reading the newspaper, coffee in hand. Mr. Walsh, can I ask you something? He glanced up, expression unreadable. Of course. Do you know anything about my past, my family? He stiffened. Why would you ask that? Because I found an old picture of a woman who looks just like me. With you, silence. Then, that's not your concern. His voice was calm. Too calm. I felt my throat close. It is if that woman is my mother. He stood abruptly. You're here to do a job, Miss Moore? I suggest you focus on it. And just like that, he walked away. But his hands? They were shaking. Just like the day Isla called me sister. The photograph in the drawer. After Ethan shut the conversation down, I spent the rest of the day moving like a ghost. I changed Isla's clothes, but my hands were on autopilot. I sang her lullaby, but I didn't hear the words. My mind was somewhere else, stuck on the picture, on that name, on Ethan's cold tone that was far too polished to be innocent. I didn't sleep that night. I just waited. For morning, for silence, for a chance. At 5:12 a.m., the house was still. The staff hadn't arrived. Isla was asleep. Ethan's office door was unlocked. It always was. Because no one dared to enter it. Except this time I did. The room smelled like cedar and paper. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. A single desk lamp glowed dimly on the polished mahogany desk. And there, on the left-hand side, a drawer, not locked, just slightly ajar. I hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside was a folder marked, Private, Do Not Discard. And under it, a single photograph. My hands trembled. It was her again. The woman who looked like me. Only this time, she was standing in front of a hospital, holding a newborn. The same blanket I had in the photo from the linen closet. The same one I still kept in a small box under my bed. On the back in faded ink was scribbled, Eve Sim I.L. Hospital ID about 8. My heart dropped. Ethan, M. Who was M? L. Lena? Was that me? I turned to the folder. Inside were documents. Old letters, bills, legal notices. And a hospital birth certificate with the name Baby Girl Moore. Mother's name, Megan. Father's name, left blank, Megan. That had to be the M. The woman in the photo. My mother? Why hadn't I ever known? Why hadn't anyone told me? And why did Ethan keep these documents in his desk? Hidden. Suddenly I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, purposeful. I slammed the drawer shut and turned. Ethan stood in the doorway. Not angry, not surprised. Just tired. You weren't supposed to see that, he said. I stood frozen. Who was she? I asked, though I already knew. Megan, he said quietly. Your mother. It felt like the walls folded in on me. So it's true. He didn't respond. You knew? Still silence. You knew who I was all along and you said nothing? He walked into the room, his movements slow, deliberate. I didn't know at first, he finally said. Not when you applied, not when you arrived. But you looked at me like you'd seen a ghost? Because I had. He sat down in the chair beside the window, ran a hand through his graying hair. The moment I saw you with Isla, the way you looked at her, the way she looked at you, I knew. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. I clenched my fists. Why didn't you say anything? Because what would I say, Lena? Welcome home, I'm your father. Sorry I missed your entire life. What right did I have? His voice cracked. I didn't even know she had the baby. My family, they forced her to go away. They said she wasn't good for me. When I refused to break things off, they did it for me. They sent her away while I was out of the country for business. I came back, she was gone. All they told me was that she moved on. Tears welled up in my eyes. And you never looked for me? I didn't know you existed. Not until I saw your face and remembered hers. The weight of his words slammed into me. So many years, so much emptiness, so much loss. I needed to know, I said. I needed to hear it, even if it hurt. He nodded slowly. I don't expect you to forgive me, but you deserved the truth. And I was a coward for not telling you sooner. Silence stretched between us. Not cold, just broken. Isla called me her sister, I whispered. Ethan looked up. A tear slid down his cheek. Because somehow maybe she felt it. Maybe she knew before either of us did. I stood up, unsure what to do next. I need time. Of course. And space. Take all you need. I turned to leave. But before I did, I looked back one last time. I spent my whole life wondering why no one wanted me. Now I have to figure out what to do with the truth that someone did. And they lost me anyway. I walked out of that office with my legs shaking, but my heart finally starting to beat in a rhythm that felt real. I was adopted, but there's more they didn't tell me. I left the Walsh estate before sunrise. No suitcase, no plan, just a purse, a scarf, and a storm inside my chest that wouldn't stop spinning. I didn't tell Ethan goodbye. I didn't know how. How do you say goodbye to someone who's been a stranger your whole life, only to find out they were supposed to be your beginning? The taxi dropped me off in front of the red brick building that still had the chipped paint and the broken mailbox it had when I was a child. St. Margaret's Home for Children. Even the name sounded like an apology that never landed. I hadn't been back in years. Not since the day I aged out and walked away with 2 garbage bags of belongings and no one waving from the door. Inside, the halls smelled like old paper and mop water. The same creaky floorboards, the same dull lights flickering above. And then her, Miss Granger, I said, almost breathless. She looked up from her desk. Her hair was grayer now, but her eyes were still sharp. Lena Moore? You've grown. I came back, I need help. She invited me in, offered weak coffee and a place to sit. I need to see my file again, I said. All of it, not just what the system let me see. Her face shifted. Subtle, but enough to catch. Lena, those records are sealed. You already saw what you were allowed to see years ago. I know, but there's more. And I think you know it. I told her everything. The photographs, the name Megan, the connection to Ethan Walsh. Her hands trembled slightly as she set her mug down. I was hoping this day wouldn't come. She stood and walked to a locked cabinet in the back, pulled out a thin, dusty file with a red tag across the corner. You weren't supposed to be here, you know, she said softly. What does that mean? You were dropped off in the middle of the night. No name, no ID. But a week later, I received a letter. No return address. It said to name you Lena, and to never tell you who brought you in. Did you recognize the handwriting? She hesitated, then nodded. It was a woman named Megan. She used to come here as a volunteer. Quiet, kind. One day she just stopped coming. We never knew why. My breath caught. So she left me here? I think she didn't have a choice, but she tried to protect you. What else does the file say? Miss Granger opened it. Inside were 2 pages. One printed, one handwritten. The printed one was the standard placement report, but the handwritten one was a note, folded, yellowed by time. She handed it to me. You should read this. My fingers shook as I opened it. To whoever takes care of my daughter, her name is Lena. She has her father's eyes. Please don't tell him. It's safer this way. He comes from a family that doesn't believe in women like me, but he would have loved her. I know he would have. If she ever asks, tell her I tried. Tell her I named her after the song he used to hum when he held me. Please, keep her safe. Tears blurred the page. She hadn't abandoned me. She had protected me. even if it meant vanishing completely. Did anyone ever come back asking about me? I asked, voice cracking. Miss Granger bit her lip. Once, when you were about 7, a man in a black car. He never came in, just sat outside, looking through the gate for hours. Then he left. Did he say his name? No, but he looked like you. Ethan. He didn't know who I was then, but something must have pulled him here. Some invisible string of guilt or instinct or longing. And maybe he was too late or too scared. But now I knew. As I held the letter, something fell from between the pages. A second photo. One I hadn't seen before. It was Megan, holding me as a baby, and behind her, a woman I didn't recognize, older, dressed in designer clothes. She looked angry, hands clenched at her side. On the back of the photo, one word. Margaret. Who's Margaret? I asked. Miss Granger stiffened. She was one of the donors, very wealthy, very involved in deciding which children got adopted and which didn't. Why is she in a photo with my mother? Her silence said everything. Miss Granger, what are you not telling me? She sighed. Margaret Walsh, she's Ethan's mother. My heart stopped. The woman who stood in the background of my baby photo, the one who looked like she wanted Megan to disappear, was the reason I was never claimed. She kept him from knowing, I whispered. Yes, Miss Granger confirmed. And she made sure no one would ever trace you back. The betrayal wasn't just personal now. It was systemic, deliberate, a legacy of silence that spanned generations. I stood slowly, clutching the letter, the photo, the truth. Thank you, I said, for keeping it, for letting me see. What will you do now? I looked out the window. Same iron gates, same gray skies. I don't know. But I'm done being the secret. It's time someone else lived in the shadow for once. DNA doesn't lie, but hearts. I never thought I'd willingly walk into a lab with a swab in one hand and my heart in the other. But there I was, sitting in a sterile white room, answering identity questions I had only recently learned the answers to. Your name? Lena Moore. And the person you believe may be your biological parent? Ethan Walsh. I said it without shaking. But inside, I was trembling so hard I thought the walls could hear it. The technician was kind, soft-spoken, professional. She handed me a cotton swab and a small tube. This will only take a minute to confirm what my soul had started to suspect, a minute to undo 23 years of not knowing where I came from. When it was done, she sealed the envelope, wrote the tracking number, and handed me a receipt. Results will be available in 5 business days. 5 days. What was I supposed to do at that time? How do you wait for something that could rewrite your life? I didn't go back to the estate. I checked into a small hotel off 83rd Street, the kind with yellow hallways and flickering hallway lights. The walls were thin. I could hear someone's TV through the vents. And yet, for the first time, I felt safe. Because no one expected anything from me. No one looked at me like I was supposed to smile back. I spent those 5 days reading my mother's letter over and over. Her handwriting was gentle, looped. The kind of penmanship that made you believe the writer had cried while holding the pen. She has his eyes, she wrote. Every time I looked in the mirror now, I saw that line staring back at me. And every time I blinked, I wondered if Ethan saw it too, or if he just refused to look. On the 6th day, I received an email with the subject line, Paternity Test Results, Confidential. I didn't open it right away. I stared at it for a full hour. Let it sit there like a grenade. Because once I clicked, there'd be no going back to the before. But then I did. And the words were as clear as daylight. Probability of paternity, 99.99% conclusion. Mr. Ethan Walsh is the biological father of Ms. Lena Moore. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, numb. Because it wasn't a surprise. Not anymore. I had already started mourning the lie before the truth even arrived. I printed the results, put them in a plain envelope. And the next morning, I took a cab back to the estate. The gates opened without a word. I didn't expect a welcome. I didn't need one. When I walked into the foyer, the butler startled. Miss Moore, Mr. Walsh didn't say you were coming. He didn't know. I walked straight to the study. And just like fate planned it, Ethan was there. Same chair, same window, only this time I wasn't the same. He looked up, startled. Lena, we don't have to guess anymore, I said, placing the envelope on the table. I brought proof. He stared at it but didn't reach for it. I don't need it, he said quietly. I already knew. Then why didn't you say it? Because I was afraid. Silence. That word again. Fear. It had robbed me of a childhood, of a mother, of a name. And now, even as the truth sat on the table between us, fear still ruled. Do you know what it's like? I whispered. To grow up wondering why you weren't wanted? His eyes filled with something that looked like agony. I would have wanted you, he said, if I had known. But you didn't look. Because I didn't know where to begin. I took a shaky breath. The truth is, DNA doesn't lie. But hearts, they can pretend. They can hide. Do you love Isla? I asked suddenly, more than my life. Then you understand what it feels like to want to protect something so fiercely. You'd burn the world down for them. He nodded slowly. Then tell me, why couldn't you fight for me too? Tears finally spilled. From him. From me. From the years neither of us could reclaim. I don't know how to be your father now, he said. And I don't know how to be your daughter. I stood. But maybe say we start by being two broken people who don't want to hide anymore. He didn't answer. He just nodded. And for the first time when he looked at me, he didn't look away. Why didn't you want me? The room was quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This time there was no fear between us. No suspicion, just air thick with unspoken years, and the fragile thread between a daughter asking why and a man finally ready to answer. Ethan poured 2 glasses of water with trembling hands. His posture was stiff, as if the truth was something heavy he had carried for decades. And now, finally, it was time to set it down. You asked why I didn't want you, he began. But the truth is, I never even got the chance to know you existed. He sat across from me, but his eyes weren't on me. They were somewhere else, years away. I met your mother, Megan, in college. She wasn't from my world. She was fire in a room full of marble statues. Everything about her was alive. His voice cracked on the word alive. We kept it quiet. My mother didn't approve. Said she was too loud, too wild, too poor, too everything. But I didn't care. He exhaled as if trying to catch up to the memories. We talked about marriage, about children. She wanted 3. I wanted a house by the lake. And then one day, I came back from a business trip early. She was gone. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Gone? I whispered. He nodded. Her number was disconnected, her apartment was empty. No trace, no goodbye, nothing. I confronted my mother. Demanded answers. She said Megan left on her own, said she took money and ran. I believed her. His voice broke. I was young, stupid. I didn't think my own mother could lie like that. I thought maybe Megan hadn't loved me the way I loved her. I swallowed hard. And then I buried it, threw myself into work, tried to forget. Eventually, I met Isla's mother. It wasn't love like Megan, but it was stable, safe, until she passed. He blinked away a memory I couldn't see. And then you showed up? He looked at me, finally. The moment I saw you, Lena, it was like my heart stopped. You looked exactly like her. But it wasn't just the face, it was the way you moved. The way you held Isla like she was the most important thing in the world. I didn't say anything. I let him talk. Because I needed this more than he knew. I started digging, checked your application again, found your birth records. The moment I saw the name Megan Moore, I knew. I had a daughter. He placed a hand over his chest like he was trying to steady the pieces inside. I failed both of you, and by the time I realized it, I didn't know how to fix it. So you said nothing? He looked down. At first, I was afraid you'd hate me. Then, I was afraid you wouldn't. My eyes filled with tears. You should have told me. I know. You should have looked for me. I should have done a lot of things. The raw honesty in his voice. It didn't erase the pain, but it made the silence make sense. Why didn't you ever have another child? I asked it softly, like it wasn't supposed to be asked. He smiled sadly. Because I already had one. I just didn't know where she was. Silence settled again. This time it didn't suffocate. It gave us room to breathe. To exist in a space where the past was ugly but no longer buried. Do you think she would have forgiven you? I asked. He closed his eyes. I don't know, but I hope you will. I looked at my hands, at the small star-shaped pin I'd always kept with me. I unclasped it, slid it across the table to him. She left this with me. He picked it up with reverence. Tears fell. No words, just years of silence being shattered by a tiny piece of metal and the ache of too many goodbyes that never happened. I don't know how to be your daughter, I whispered. But I'd like to try. He reached across the table, his hand for the first time, and held mine. Not like an employer, not like a stranger, but like a father. She's not my boss's daughter. She's my sister. The days that followed were strangely quiet, not in the way grief is quiet, but in the way healing whispers instead of screams. I didn't move back in with Ethan. Not yet. We both needed space to rebuild something from scratch. And there's no blueprint for becoming a father after 23 years of silence. But I visited. Almost every day. We talked about my childhood, my favorite book growing up, how I once fell off a swing set trying to fly. He laughed. softly, like he hadn't laughed in years. And Isla? Isla didn't change at all. Still called me sister like it was the most natural word in the world. Still ran into my arms, still asked for me at bedtime. And now, I couldn't unhear it. Sister, sister, sister. Because she was right all along. Ethan hadn't said it aloud yet. Neither had I. But the math was simple. If I was his daughter, and Isla was his daughter too, then she wasn't just the child I nannied. She was my sister. I sat on the edge of Isla's bed one night after reading her favorite book. She was already drifting to sleep, her little fingers curled around mine. "Do you think I'll have a sister one day?" She mumbled. "You already do." She smiled in her sleep, as if she'd known all along. Later that evening, Ethan and I stood in the hallway outside her room. He leaned against the wall, arms folded, eyes distant. "She's going to know eventually," I said. He nodded. "And she deserves to. She already calls me her sister." He smiled faintly. "She always had a sense about people." Silence. Then, "Do you regret anything?" he asked. "Only not knowing sooner," I whispered. "I think I could have loved her the same, even if I knew." He turned to face me. And now, I looked at him, at this man who was both the source of my greatest question and now the one finally offering an answer. Now I just want to do it right. The next day, I brought Isla to the park. We watched ducks, she chased butterflies. I laughed more than I had in years. And when we sat on the bench under the willow tree, she looked up and said, "When I grow up, can I be like you?" I swallowed. "Why me?" "Because you came to my life when I was lonely. And you didn't go away." Tears welled in my eyes. "You came to mine too, Isla." I held her tighter. And for the first time, I felt what it meant to belong to someone. Later that night, Ethan asked me to come into his office. He handed me a folder. Inside was paperwork. Legal guardianship forms, financial records, a trust fund, and an amendment. "I want to make it official," he said. "Not for the world, for you." "What do you mean?" "I want to acknowledge you publicly, as my daughter. I want you to carry my name if you choose to." I stared at the paper. "And Isla?" "We'll tell her, gently, together." I nodded slowly, but inside, I was shaking. Not from fear this time. From the realization that this chapter of my life, the one written in silence and doubt, was ending, and a new one was ready to begin. I tucked the paper away, but one thing still lingered. "There's something else," I said quietly. "Something I need to know." He raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "Your mother, Margaret Walsh. She was in a photo with my mother, and she knew." His face darkened. "Yes. She kept you from knowing me." "She did." I took a breath. "What happens now?" He looked at me, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice. "Now, we don't let her win. We don't stay silent. We tell Isla. We stand together, and we make sure no one else gets erased from this family again." I smiled. Not because it was all fixed, but because it was finally real. I finally have a family. But can I forgive the past? The sky was soft the morning I stood on the steps of the Walsh estate again. Like even the weather knew something was shifting. I clutched the envelope in my hand. Inside, the signed legal documents, my new birth certificate, a letter I wrote but hadn't yet decided whether to send. Isla greeted me like always, arms wide, heart first. But this time, when she called me sister, I knelt down, looked her in the eyes, and said softly, "Isla, that's not just a pretend game anymore." "It's not?" "No, sweetheart, it's real. I'm your sister. We have the same dad." She blinked, then giggled. I knew it. Children don't need long explanations. They just need the truth to feel safe. And love to make it stick. She hugged me tighter than ever. That afternoon, Ethan and I sat in the garden. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden shadows between us. He handed me a photo, the last one he had of Megan. "She'd be proud of you," he said. "You think so?" "I know so. You have her strength." I smiled. "And your eyes." Then came the question I had avoided for weeks. "Do you want to meet her?" I turned. Standing just inside the glass doors was a tall woman, dignified, polished, and cold. Margaret Walsh, the woman who had stolen a lifetime from me. "She's asked to see you," Ethan said carefully. "But it's your choice." I didn't respond, not at first. But something inside me said, "You can't rebuild truth on top of silence." So I stood, walked across the patio, and opened the door. She looked at me like she had seen a ghost. Not because I looked like Megan, but because I was what she had tried to erase. And yet, here I was. Flesh, voice, will. "Hello, Margaret," I said. "Lena." Her voice cracked. "You look so much like her. And yet you didn't want me to exist." She looked down. For the first time, the powerful, polished matriarch looked small. "I was wrong," she whispered. "You were cruel." She didn't argue. I thought I was protecting him, our name, our legacy. But I destroyed his. I swallowed. You destroyed a lot more than that. I know. Then why are you here? She lifted her eyes. Because I needed to see what survived despite me. I should have yelled. Should have thrown something. Should have made her hurt. But I didn't. Because some scars don't need revenge. They just need to stop bleeding. I'm not here to forgive you, I said. But I won't let you control this family anymore. Understood. Isla will grow up knowing everything. And you? You'll be a name in her history, not a voice in her future. Titinche. Her lips quivered. She nodded and walked away. That was the last time I ever saw her. Weeks passed, then months. We found a rhythm. Ethan and I didn't try to rewrite the past. We just made space for the future. Dinners with Isla, conversations about school, even awkward father-daughter inside jokes. I didn't move in, but I was home. On the anniversary of Megan's birthday, we lit a candle. Ethan stood beside me, holding Isla's hand. To the woman who named me but gave me the strength to name myself. I whispered those words into the flame. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt whole. The nanny no one noticed. The daughter no one claimed. The girl who was erased now had a name, a father, a sister, and a voice. Some people leave scars, others leave lessons. Burn and reborn stories that break you, then rebuild you.